Asking the right questions. Upon successful completion of this module, you will be able to specify study objectives and write testable hypotheses. Study objectives are the purposes for performing a study. They are written in terms of a scientific question and are not dependent on a specific outcome. An example of a study objective might be to assess the effectiveness of daily aspirin use in preventing myocardial infarction in patients with a high risk of cardiovascular disease. Note that the objective is not to prove that aspirin is effective, but merely to evaluate its effectiveness. The study objective can be met by showing that aspirin is effective, is not effective, or is even harmful for this purpose. I will discuss 4 types of objectives that I often see in my work with the medical center. This is not an exhaustive list of types, or even the types I have seen, but the concepts presented here should be transferable to a wide range of objectives. These common objectives relate to treatment effects, comparisons and associations, feasibility, and descriptions. An example of an objective addressing a treatment effect is to assess the effectiveness of daily aspirin use in preventing myocardial infarction in patients with a high risk of cardiovascular disease. Treatment effects describe the average difference between outcomes caused by 2 or more treatments. Average differences are often described in terms of differences in means, differences in proportions, odds ratios, or hazard ratios. Evaluating a treatment effect is often the ultimate goal of therapeutic research programs. Ideally, treatment effect objectives are addressed by a randomized controlled trial. Similar setups can be used both for beneficial effects or adverse effects in the context of a safety study. 2 similar terms are often used in writing study objectives, but the difference between them is meaningful. Efficacy is when a treatment provides the desired results under ideal conditions, generally measured in tightly controlled clinical settings. On the other hand, effectiveness is when a treatment produces benefit under real-world conditions. Effectiveness can be evaluated in large-scale trials with simple data collection in broad populations. These are often called pragmatic trials. A useful mnemonic for the components of study objectives addressing treatment effects is Pico: population or problem, intervention, comparison or control, and outcome. In the aspirin study's primary objective, the population is patients with a high risk of cardiovascular disease. The intervention is daily aspirin. The comparison is no daily aspirin or possibly a placebo, and the outcome is the occurrence of myocardial infarction. Not all objectives follow this pattern, but those addressing treatment effects usually do. Outcome definitions must be specific enough to translate clinical data into a single number, categorization, or yes/no answer for a statistician to use in analysis. An example of a vague outcome definition is just myocardial infarction. But which MIs count? Is there a time limit to follow-up? How do we treat multiple occurrences in a single patient? And are we interested in how long it takes, or just whether or not there is one? A more specific example would be occurrence of at least one myocardial infarction within 5 years after randomization. It's not necessary to write the full specific version of the outcome everywhere, but it must be defined somewhere prominent in each document. One way to help ensure your hypotheses are testable is to formulate null and alternative hypotheses, the same kind of statements statistical tests use. A statistical test tries to disprove a null hypothesis, often that 2 things are the same. If the null hypothesis can be proven false, then its opposite, the alternative hypothesis, can be concluded to be true. An example of a null hypothesis is that the proportion of participants who experience myocardial infarction within 3 years after randomization is the same among those who are randomized to take daily aspirin and those who are not. If a statistical test disproves this hypothesis, we can conclude the alternative hypothesis that the proportion of participants who experience myocardial infarction within 5 years after randomization is different among those who are randomized to take daily aspirin and those who are not. Sometimes patients are not randomized between interventions, or the exposures we're interested in are not interventions at all. Consider the objective to assess the association between daily aspirin use and risk of myocardial infarction in patients with a high risk of cardiovascular disease. This is a comparison between patients who happen to use daily aspirin and those who do not, even though the patients have not been randomized to those two groups. In general, comparisons describe the average difference in outcomes between people who happen to experience an exposure versus those who happen to experience a different exposure. These differences may be caused by the exposure or by something else and can be assessed by observational studies. Comparisons look at differences between two or more groups. An example would be to compare proportions of patients hospitalized for COVID-19 who were discharged alive among those who were age 60 plus versus those who were 59 or younger. Associations are more general and look at the relationship between variables, even if they don't define groups. An example would be to assess the association between age and length of hospital stay among patients hospitalized for COVID-19. There are two variables, age and length of stay, but they don't necessarily define groups. Sometimes we just want to describe a population without necessarily making a comparison or doing any tests. Examples of this type of objective are to determine the number of patients treated for colorectal cancer at the OSU Comprehensive Cancer Center each year, to describe the demographics, age, sex, or race, of patients treated for colorectal cancer, and to determine the proportion of patients treated for colorectal cancer at the OSU Comprehensive Cancer Center from 2015 to 2019 who were referred to palliative care. Studies with descriptive objectives are often needed to gauge potential impact of an intervention or larger study, and confidence intervals are usually more useful than hypothesis tests. Finally, one more type of objective I often see addresses feasibility of some intervention, program, or study. Feasibility can include descriptive objectives for multiple facets of feasibility, such as those addressing recruitment and retention rates, and whether appointments can be kept and measurements taken reliably. They don't necessarily need to use formal hypothesis tests, and can simply observe things such as whether or not clinical centers carry through with their commitments and how long various stages of the project take. This objective is often stated for early or pilot studies, but it is very important to specify what exactly would make the eventual program feasible, and how you would evaluate whether or not those criteria are met. Think about how you would define a go, no-go decision rule for a large-scale program based on the results of the pilot study. To sum up, as much as possible, use Pico to define study objectives. Not every component may apply to every type of objective, but it is a useful place to start. Outcome definitions must be specific enough to translate clinical data into a single number, categorization, or yes-no answer for a statistician to use in analysis. The hypothesis that we want to disprove is the null hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is what we can conclude when we disprove the null hypothesis. We conclude with a few resources to help you practice conducting rigorous scientific research, and highly recommend that you consult with a biostatistician on your study early in the process. Thank you.